Hey everyone, welcome back to the Caderna podcast. I'm Brian Caderna. So before we dive into today's interview, I just want to take a quick moment to remind everyone to please like and subscribe the show wherever you watch or listen. That's how we continue to attract awesome guests like the one I have on today's show. This episode is also brought to you by Weekly Wealthy Wisdoms, my free weekly newsletter that you can receive in your inbox every Monday, where I share my latest insights and findings in all things wealth. And I define wealth in its original meaning, a state of well-being. You'll see things like travel tips, health hacks, financial planning advice. Always stay up to date on our latest podcast episodes, really cool quotes from some of the greatest minds of all time, and much more. You can sign up for Weekly Wealthy Wisdoms by going to www.briancaderna.com. Now on to today's episode. Today, I'll be joined by Kate O'Neill. Let me give you a quick background if you're not familiar. Kate O'Neill is a tech humanist. Don't worry, we're going to get into what exactly that means, and a strategic advisor for some of the top organizations in the world, including Google, Yale, the United Nations, and much more. She says that the disrupting tech we all see today isn't a matter of who can move fastest, but who can move forward most responsibly, with empathy to the customer and end user, leveraging tech to bring more value every day. Kate was one of the first 100 employees at Netflix, where she pioneered the first content management role. She developed Toshiba America's first intranet and founded the Meta Marketer, one of the earliest digital strategy and analytics agencies. Kate has a new book out titled What Matters Next: A Leader's Guide to Making Human-Friendly Tech Decisions in a World That's Moving Too Fast. We cover everything from how to be the best seasoned leader to how to be the best rising star in your organization, and pretty much everything in between. And speaking of AI, this conversation that we're having, it took place just shortly after DeepSeek revealed their ability to achieve comparable results to major AI players with less resources and only $6 million of training costs, allegedly, I might add. So as we talk about staying ahead of the curve, how to become the best employee, the best leader, the best organization, we can learn a lot today from my guest, Kate O'Neill.
Is going to require work and time and sweat and toil.
If money wasn't an issue, what would I be doing?
Don't worry about it. You'll figure it out.
Change is the only constant.
The Caderna Podcast.
Kate, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Brian. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I thought this was a very timely topic. I feel like tech is just like moving at the speed of light. And I feel like every day that you wake up at this point, it's almost a new day. There's a new thing that you may have to learn. I love it, but it's a lot to keep up with. How are you managing tech in today's world?
Well, I think it is for everybody a lot to keep up with. But it's been my sort of passion area for a few decades now, and I've always been pretty interested in the movements of tech. But I think the reason why, I wrote this book and why this particular focus on the decision-making side around tech is of interest to me is because over the last few years, speaking to audiences of leaders, I would give my keynote on technology, tech humanism, how to think about the human experience as you're building new technology. And the thing that I heard most from leaders who would come up to me after the keynote in their questions was how to do this, how to kind of think about the future, how to think about, what might be coming down the road when everything feels so uncertain and and things are moving so fast all the time. Their biggest concern, and I imagine a lot of your listeners are leaders themselves.
Sure.
And so it might feel very relevant for you as a listener to hear this, that, it feels like as soon as you make a decision on a particular tech platform, you're sort of taking a gamble that in 3 to 6 months, that's not going to be a sort of defunct platform and everybody has moved on to the next thing or
Sure.
whatever. And I think that feels very real to many people who are making decisions in the space around technology. So I wanted to help put some context around that for people
Sure.
and give leaders some decision-making frameworks.
And I think one of the things too, like when you talk about like which technology to adopt or which platform to hop on, I think one of the things that's so hard is there's always like a bit of a natural hesitancy to say, hey, this works, it's legit, let's go for it. But then you see the people that usually benefit the most are the ones that were there first, and they got to market sooner than their competitors or their peers. So, I mean, I guess what does that go into this decision-making process when you know you're going to take a gamble, you want to wait for more data to make a decision, but you know that that's costing you. And often it benefits you just to say, let's take the leap of faith, but then obviously you need a little bit of luck on your side.
Yeah, so I was able to pull together a range of stories and examples for this book and talk about some examples where people had great vision and then sort of failed to commit and execute. And those are examples like Research in Motion with BlackBerry and Polaroid and Kodak, being sort of Kodak especially being sort of famously early in the digital camera space, but then not really committing to it. So we have examples like that. And then you have examples like Netflix, for example, who, the leadership of Netflix, back when I was there, it was 99, 2000, 2001. We were still very much an upstart company in a market that had one very big competitor. That was Blockbuster, of course.
Of course, yeah.
And, even then, even as an upstart player and one that by no means looked certain to win, we were, the leadership at the company at the time, Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph and the rest of the leadership team, were investing money and time and resources into what we were then calling set-top boxes, which was the predecessor to streaming as we now know it. And if you just think about how visionary that is to be 6-7 years ahead of whatever the technology pivot is actually going to be, while you're actually battling, an existential battle with the market dominant force, it really is to me, it's been one of the most visionary examples I've been able to witness and witness up close. And to be able to take away from that the sense that there are times when you're able to think ahead to the most distant future you can possibly envision. And what it tells you is you don't necessarily need to adopt that most distant vision, but you do need to try to figure out what are today's steps that you can iterate toward. How can you build yourself a trajectory that allows yourself room to grow and learn and wiggle and figure out, how to adjust and pivot for true north. All of those things that we learn about in the startup space that I think a lot of times by the time someone's running a small to mid-sized company or an enterprise company, they're not really thinking about pivots anymore. They're thinking about, moving a huge ship in a big direction. And it's harder to make those kinds of choices.
Even to start there, a great example, and obviously with your experience with Netflix, in the early days, when nobody even knew what that name was. And like you said, everybody just knew Blockbuster. And that was the thing, Friday night, you got nothing to do, go to Blockbuster. You could just kind of thumb through a billion, movies or VHS tapes even and pick one. What was the idea with Netflix? You said you don't want to get too committed to this distant vision of something that's almost like sci-fi. Early on, right? It was just like you could go and, if I remember correctly, you would actually get a DVD at that was Netflix, right? The box outside of CVS or Walgreens, and you could
no,
exchange.
Actually, you're thinking of Redbox.
Redbox.
It's funny that you do conflate that though, because the guy who ended up being CEO of that company, Redbox, was Mitch Lowe, who was the VP of marketing, I think, at Netflix in the years that I was there. So it's all in the family,
So it comes together. My mistake on that. So with Netflix, day one, what was their vision? Was it to become a streaming studio, or were these some things that had not even been considered yet?
No, it's really interesting. There's been a number of pivots, 6 or more major pivots that Netflix has been through. And we talk about this on my podcast, the Tech Humanist Show. I had Dr. Joel Meyer on to discuss, and Joel was one of my colleagues at Netflix in those early days. He headed up marketing there, and he co-authored a study in the last few years that looks at some of those major pivots and looks from an academic sort of scholarly perspective at what they did and how they were ahead of the market on so many occasions. And they got one or two things wrong. over the years, but mostly they got things right. And one of those early things was figuring out, they knew they wanted to rent DVDs by mail. That's the early
right.
premise,
Yep.
right? And the earliest premise was rent DVDs by mail, just as any other video rental company is doing it, like one at a time, and you're paying per rental. And then when they figured out the subscription model of a queue that you could just set up and say, these are the movies I would like to see, I would like to get 3 out at a time, and just send me the next one when I send in the one that I finished. That was when I joined the company, because I saw that I was a customer of the company. I lived in the Bay Area, was one of the
Yep.
few people who knew it at the time. And I saw this idea that they put out. They introduced it as an alpha project and invited me to, as a customer, to be part of the program. And once I saw it, I was like, you're on to something. And I sent them my resume and I said, I don't know what you need, but here's what I can do. And so they created a role for me, and I went and joined the company in that content manager capacity.
That's cool.
But I came on just as they were sunsetting that a la carte rental program and really ramping up the subscription model. But
And
as you
what
know,
was-
of course,
Just to hop in, Kate, what was like
Yeah,
your
sure.
background at that stage? Like when you said, I like this idea. I don't think anyone would call that a tech company yet, but they kind of morphed into this monster. What was your background and how did that kind of evolve within this evolving company?
they were a tech company in the sense that they were doing e-commerce. And in 1999, renting DVDs by mail was just about as sophisticated as e-commerce was
It's
getting,
wild. To
right?
even think of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was very much tech. And at that time, I had been in Silicon Valley for several years working at different startups. And I'd come out, my background, my educational background is in languages and linguistics. So that's always a funny little
That's crazy.
pivot to the story. Yeah. And I talk about that in the book, in the early pages of the book, about how, for me, that metaphor of languages and translation, how we communicate with one another, has always been relevant in the way I think about technology, but it's never been more relevant than it is at this moment, when large language models are dominating the way we think about AI and what that future looks like for us. But that's a tangent. To say I came out to Silicon Valley and was doing a lot of content related work, so technical publication work, building websites, everything related to. We didn't really have a lot of the established vocabulary around content yet, things we know now to be information architecture and content strategy and user experience. We weren't calling it that yet, but those were the areas that I was really, kind of a natural in and helping to define for many companies. So as I came into Netflix, I had been doing that for a series of startups over the previous several years, and was able to bring just an array of skills that related to those kinds of things with me.
And what do you think? I mean, there's the obvious, and no pun intended, of Netflix kind of led the way into this whole new world that now you have all these other ones, your Disney Pluses, Apple TV, everybody kind of hopping on board. Meanwhile, Blockbuster owned the market. There was nothing else. And they just became extinct. They went the way of the dinosaur like so quickly. Can you share some of those kind of insights of adopting tech, ignoring it, or like, I don't know if you have anything there, especially like on the Blockbuster side of like, how do you not see this coming? And almost like they couldn't handle the truth.
Yeah. And there's some great stories that get told in Reed Hastings and Mark Randolph's memoirs, and I would highly recommend reading those if anybody out there is really interested in some of the details on all that, because there's some great stories there. But I will just say that it was tempting as I was writing What Matters Next. Whenever I came to a moment where I wanted to sort of share an example of a company that missed the moment of their industry, it was tempting to use Blockbuster as an example.
Yeah.
And I tried not to beat the dead horse too often. Someone gifted me, you can see in the background here, I have a Blockbuster and Chill sign someone gave me.
That's funny.
It's a fun little joke in our shared cultural past, but I think there are so many other examples too I think we can sort of intuit what happened with Blockbuster, right? We can see that they had the opportunity. We know that they had the opportunity to invest in Netflix, to perhaps buy Netflix, and all of these opportunities did not come to fruition because the leadership did not have the vision to see it through. But we've seen that happen in many, many companies in much smaller scale in some cases, but at the same kind of scale, again with Kodak or RIM or a number of other examples. When you are faced as a leader with something that looks like it's going to be a paradigm change, it's going to be a way of doing business that differs from what you do today. And hint, there's a big AI paradigm change happening afoot, right? And for many of the people who are listening in your industry, I would imagine it's being transformed by AI.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we hit a wall as human decision makers, is that we have the benefit of our imagination. It's something that no other animals that we know of really have in the way that we do. The ability to imagine futures and really sort of see ourselves in them and understand at some level what the consequences of those futures might be. But we actually have to train ourselves. It's like running a marathon, right? Like, you have to train yourself with the skills that it takes to actually execute within that intuitive ability. We can all intuitively run. We have that ability. But we would never just go like, you know what, today I'm going to run a marathon. Like, you have to build up to it. So what the opportunity I think here is to recognize that we have to build a set of tools and disciplines, such as the ability to think in terms of foresights and insights, the ability to look around us and ask good questions about what our environment is presenting us with, the challenges we have in our environment. And one of the learning models in the book is to take the situation that you're in, ask good questions about it, but also recognize that the answers that you get back are inherently only partial answers. And it's your job as a leader to synthesize those partial answers into insights that will actually then help you, in a sense, decode what the opportunity in front of you really is. Like, are you making a timely decision about the approach you're going to take today, while at the same time setting aside some further insight, a foresight, in fact, about what might be important in the future? That is how I think you can deconstruct the Netflix example, is to say that as you're looking ahead, you might be able to say, at some point, DVDs might not be the paradigm, the modality by which people are consuming movies at home. If that time comes and we're still in business, what's it going to look like? And, the best we can figure, it's going to probably look like set-top boxes. So we probably should be prepared for that on some level. And we're not going to throw our entire business into that model yet, because we're not there yet. And if we did, we would throw ourselves right out of business. It would have been too early to move if Netflix had done that before the DVD market had really gotten saturated, right? Had been through its paces. So, but they did make the decision at the right time. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, no. So I think some of the things I'm kind of hearing from you, if I could summarize, is, the imagination and the emotional element of humans, obviously, that we have. Computers apparently do not have that yet with AI. So in a sense, that can almost be a competitive advantage of the human versus the robot. And like it sounds like what you were saying is, when you're looking at some of these strategies, you almost want to remove the thing that we're relying on or that we're accustomed to. And then if we remove that, whether that was the DVD or whatever, then imagine kind of what would be next, what would be the next iteration of that if we didn't operate every single day on the same platform that we're used to. Would that be like an exercise that you think, companies ought to be doing, saying, hey, this is the way we do things, scrap it. We took away your keyboard. Now, how are you writing, without that, and see what those next ideas evolve into?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. I recommend a series of models, and the book contains many of them. As a consultant and advisor, I have a sort of toolbox of models that I run clients through. Some of them are in this book, and one of them is the recognition that there is a kind of through line thinking to the way we need to assess all this, that the actions and decisions that we've already made in the past continue to bear on the moment that we're in, the present, and the decisions that we make today are going to continue to have shape and substance in the future. And as the better we think about that through line, the easier it is to really understand at a very graspable level the actions and decisions, the consequences of those decisions. What that means is that we can also think about, so I call that the now next continuum, and it really kind of plots that analysis along that timeline. But it also looks at things like what I call the harms of action and the harms of inaction. So when you have come to a point where you have a lot of information that tells you you should be making a decision and you don't, you're encountering the harms of inaction. And when you make a decision before you have gathered up all of the information that you really should gather, or all of the consequences that you should understand before you make the decision, you're bringing about the harms of action. So that's kind of along that continuum. There's also, we think oftentimes about digital transformation and innovation as if they're the same thing, but they actually are two almost like mirror images of one another. Digital transformation is about catching up to the moment that you're in and sort of what expectations there already are in the marketplace or what your competitors are already doing. How are you going to be competitive with whatever the sort of de facto standard is? Whereas innovation is about looking ahead, taking away the keyboard in your example, and thinking about what might the modalities of the future be. So all of these techniques, all of these tools and frameworks are kind of different ways of doing the same thing, which is allowing yourself to think in this timeline and really think about the connectedness of your business, where it stands relative to what people are expecting of you, where the value trade-off is, and how you can continue to deliver on the value people expect from you while introducing new and more relevant experiences for people as time goes on.
So a question, there's so much I could kind of dive into with this, but just because it's on my mind, right now I'm reading the biography of Walt Disney. And one of the things he had talked about, like in the early days, so early 1930s, Disney Studios was just coming about. And what was like a novel idea at the time is that he would hire the best he could, and he'd say, you're going to be just an animator. And that's all you're going to do is animate, actually draw these cartoons and such. Then he had guys that he said, you're going to be the new gag guy. Those were like the jokes or whatever that would become the cartoons, which Walt Disney used to do all this himself. Then he started to kind of, send this out to his minions. And then he hired the guy. And that was what was so crazy, is that he had this one guy that he was a full-time employee, and all he was supposed to do is come up with new jokes, new gags that would create these episodes. My question to you is, like, now in the modern era with these companies, should the leaders be setting aside, one day a week, I'm just going to think, I'm going to innovate and look to that, not just digital transform to keep up with competitors, but try and innovate a new landscape? Or should they be hiring a new gag person that's their job, is to sit there and think of crazy ideas that can become the future? Like, what are you consulting some of your clients about?
I love that question more than I've loved any question I've had in the longest time. That is such a great setup and insight. So I think it brings together a lot of insights. One, it brings up this thing that I've talked about for several years, which is that when we talk about the future of work and the future of jobs, we're actually conflating two different ideas. There's the future of work is a very company-centric sort of model. It's looking at what is the future of like the employer-employee relationship going to be? What is the future of the workplace going to look like? But the future of jobs speaks to this much more human existential angst of how am I going to make money, and how am I going to provide for my family? How am I going to make a contribution? How am I going to feel like I'm relevant and contributing my skills and doing some valuable work? Those are two very different sets of questions, and they only intersect because they happen in the same place, right? They happen in that same contract. So what it does us really a lot of good to, break those apart and really think about those separately. And I think for leaders, it means a lot to do that as well. So to your point, setting aside a day or however much time you can in a reasonable rhythm to think and to reevaluate and to make sure that I advocate for keeping an insights inventory So actually going through this process that I talk about in the book of asking the questions and gathering the insights and the foresights and really having those so that you can review them on a regular basis, because that's what actually makes your decision making easier over time, is that you have the clarity of those insights to guide you. But yeah, you absolutely need to invest in it. And you can use generative AI tools to guide you through that process. And I actually talk about that a little bit in the book as well. But I think there's just so much richness to this space. And it really is, I think what it's pointing at is that there is a gap in the way that leaders have been educated up till now to lead in the kinds of workspaces and workplaces that we've had. And we're coming to a time where the education, the MBAs and the various kinds of educations people have and the experiences people have in going into executive roles, leadership roles, is really not sufficient to the moment that we're in. So just as much as jobs are transforming, leadership roles are transforming too, and we need to be ready for that.
I would agree with that too. I mean, if you just look at, you name any of these top tech companies, from, you know, the Metas to Amazon and Tesla and on and on and on, like a commonality amongst so many of these monster CEOs is that they dropped out. They dropped out of undergrad, or they didn't go, or they went to grad school and said, forget this, I just want to go work. And it was kind of like the guys that just broke loose became these icons, rather than the thousands and thousands and thousands of, you know, MBAs out there.
Well, there's that as well. There's the whole, you know, sort of charismatic leader who drops out and becomes the iconoclastic, you know, sort of brainchild, you know, the guy who's creating the whole thing. But there's also the secondary point there is that the people that end up getting hired to lead in middle management roles, executive and middle management roles, are often coming from organizations where there have been more sort of stodgy established traditions, and they've learned to manage in much more kind of established hierarchical, you know, kind of routine types of environments. What we find is in these last 5 years especially, so post-COVID, but even in the last decade or two, we were seeing this shift toward these virtual, remote, distributed teams, and managers didn't know how to be effective in those environments. And now, especially post-COVID, you know, this whole return to office phenomenon is largely being driven by the inadequacy of management skills to be able to understand how to know what's effective and how to make effective teams function across distributed environments. And I think we have an incredible opportunity to overcome that limitation and set free the capacity and scale and opportunity that companies have, the value that can be created if we can get past that limitation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see that even all the way up to the government level right now with Doge, is like, let's just kind of grab the tree and shake it as much as we can and just kind of see how things, I guess, evolve, like when they come out the other side. So yeah, I think there's always room for innovation and kind of new ideas. I wanted to ask you, like in your book title, it's What Matters Next, but then the subtitle, A Leader's Guide to Making Human-Friendly Tech Decisions in a World That's Moving Too Fast. I get the world is moving too fast. What is a human-friendly tech decision?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that has been clear to me over the last few decades of my work is that we think about technology as the great disruptor of our lives. And that is true, but I think the reason that technology disrupts our lives is that it meets us where we live through some sort of business objective. Like, it's business that puts technology into the context where it creates human experience. And I think it's a huge opportunity for business leaders to recognize that and to think about ways to do that very intentionally and meet the human that they interact with in a way that's much more mindful of the fact that you're creating an experience that someone's going to encounter in their day-to-day life. You know, I know a lot of your listeners are in the financial space. So if you think about someone who's at whatever stage of life they're at when they're encountering a need for whatever financial service they're coming for or whatever financial product they're coming for, be it a mortgage or an investment type of thing or whatever it might be, they are in a moment that comes with a lot of emotional baggage, that comes with a lot of, sort of the context of life. And I think the companies that win and create the most effective experiences are those that are most tuned in and tapped into the empathy of what that experience really is like for people, and able to find the alignment between what makes the business successful and what makes the person successful, and then use technology to amplify and enhance that alignment, as opposed to using technology simply to make the business more effective.
It's interesting, and there's a lot to chew on there, because I feel like business, in a lot of respects, going back centuries, is just there to create a tool, a new thing then for humanity to go use, whether it's the computer, the internet, oil, you name it. They're trying to kind of bring something to market, one, to make money for themselves and their shareholders, but two, to say, hey, this is a car that can get you from point A to point B that you didn't have before. So I kind of get what you're saying of, like, to lead in that, whatever that respective business space is, to have empathy, I guess, know your customer. But also I think they just want to be as efficient and productive as possible and get the best product or tool to that end user. So I guess it's kind of, that's always a dynamic of business, kind of that tug of war there. But I guess, like, as we talk about human friendly tech, what are some ways? I mean, because when you just mentioned, like, the empathy thing in finance, a lot of the talk is like robo advisors, which is very much, mind you, like 4 or 5 years ago. That was like pre the AI boom. Just this idea that you could have a robo manage your portfolio or talk to one on a computer. And, you kind of, our argument in the industry was like, well, if you want to move $1 million here to there, you want to have a human kind of holding your hand and guiding the way.
Right.
And I believe in that. And a lot of people do, but a lot of people, especially younger folks, do not. And they are comfortable saying, hey, I'll just Google whatever and buy this insurance policy, or I'll just go here, punch in info, and have this thing put together some stock portfolio that I'll follow. And there's more of that do-it-yourself mentality. I mean, do you think there's times where organizations have to step away from that?
Well, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, as you just explained really well. I think those two examples are examples of empathy for those users, right? Like, understanding that there's a certain sort of psychographic or demographic that wants the hand-holding, and a certain psychographic or demographic that does not want the hand-holding, that wants free access and the ease of transacting in their own way, and let them sort of fall on their own sword if that's how it's going to be. They'll understand that. But there's two different modalities there, and to understand that those are two different modalities is a form of empathy, and then create the opportunity as it suits the right set of customers, and more to the point, as it suits the relationship between the company providing the service and the customer. This is what I'm getting at. It isn't about conforming everything to the customer. It's about understanding what is that relationship between what the company exists to do and is trying to do at scale, and who the person on the other side of that transaction is. Because just to say that companies exist to create a product or to make money is to ignore completely that someone exists on the other side of that relationship. So it has to be this kind of holistic understanding that the company exists to do something, but they only exist because they're able to engage an active audience to participate with them and invest their money and recognize a value exchange. And if that value exchange starts to feel hollow, or that can be fulfilled in a more satisfying way on whatever other criterion, in some other form, some other way, people are going to go there. People are going to leave Blockbuster and go to Netflix, or people are going to leave, BlackBerry and go to iPhone, or whatever the case may be. So I think that's what it looks like to see this in its entirety. It's not about saying, oh, we're just trying to be, we're trying to create a soft, purposeful sort of package for our customer. It's like, that's not really the point of empathy. The point of empathy is to recognize exactly what you just articulated, and then create the right kind of structure that facilitates whatever is the most appropriate for the relationship between the company and the customer.
Achieving the maximum value as the people see it. Yep.
Yeah,
So,
as the entirety of that relationship sees it, right?
Yes. Yep. Well said. So I want to pivot a little bit. Obviously, we're kind of going through this timeline from Blockbuster up to today. Now, obviously, we are at this AI frontier. That's the headline every single day. You recently had said, and I quote, "Consider this. While most frontier AI models require massive computational resources, 16,000 GPUs, DeepSeek, which just caught headlines, achieved comparable results with just 2,048 GPUs and $6 million in training costs." That's what I wanted to ask you about. Number one, when I heard that, and I remember waking up that morning, it was only a week ago, and seeing like, oh crap, like the stock market's going haywire. Nvidia just like tanked like 19% in a split second, and everyone's like, like what's going on? I saw that, and the first thing that came to my mind, obviously this is coming out of China, is how much is this blown out of proportion? Is this something where now we have these global superpowers kind of jockeying for superiority, obviously tech being kind of the sword that we could all brandish? That's kind of two-part question here. Is DeepSeek real? Is it effective? Is it going to be here to stay? And is it a leader? If it is, what are we looking at moving forward? Like almost what's the next iteration of AI as it, some of us see it, some of us don't, but apparently it's everywhere.
Yeah, I think as you said, there's kind of a lot in the question and a lot to unpack, but I think there's a couple of things that stand out to me. One is I think DeepSeek is real, and it's also a metaphor, right? It is kind of a stand-in for the idea that the US doesn't necessarily have a guarantee or a lock on AI dominance, and that was always going to be true. We were always going to encounter that at some point, and people have been calling it sort of the Sputnik moment or whatever example or analogy you might use to describe it. But I think the humbling nature of it is due. Like we're due for a reckoning with the fact that this is a globally relevant technology. There are a lot of people with a lot of money invested in making sure that they're a relevant contributor to this race. So, that's the game is on, right? We have to understand it that way.
Yep.
As far as DeepSeek, the technology itself, or the contributor to the actual space of large language models, it's a valid player, and it's interesting. I think there's an awful lot of, with the frontier models, it's always this kind of leapfrogging factor. Like you and I will have this conversation, and then by the time somebody's listening to it 2 weeks from now, it's going to be probably a completely different set of jockeying players taking the lead. So it does no good to try to really carve out a space to say it's this model from this company that's doing the best, because they'll hit benchmarks and then some other model will clear those benchmarks tomorrow.
True.
But that's kind of the gist of it right now. And this is very much why What Matters Next is about what it's about, because this is about why the world is moving so fast. Everyone is trying to gain that one-upsmanship. And I think the context of it sometimes lulls us into thinking that we don't have the opportunity to slow down and make good decisions, that we don't have the luxury of making ethical decisions, that we don't have the luxury of making sustainable or responsible decisions. And I think what I was pointing out in the line that you were quoting was that DeepSeek, having been developed, more has come to light since I actually wrote what I wrote there about just what technology they actually did have, what chips they did use, and maybe it wasn't quite as, scaled back as what they initially let on. Doesn't really matter. The point is that more can be done with less. And that was the real reason that NVIDIA took the dive, is because there was people who were looking at that and going like, oh, well, Jensen Huang has been on this roadshow trying to sell the most premium chips. And as it turns out, maybe it isn't the most premium chips that we need. Maybe we need, less premium chips. Maybe they're overinflated at this point. And I think, first of all, I think that's not necessarily true. I think the fundamentals of NVIDIA are still what the fundamentals of NVIDIA were before this news broke. But it doesn't nobody's asking me for my investment advice. They're asking me for my strategic leadership advice. And my strategic leadership advice is, look, it is always going to be a changing landscape. We're going to have to be in a situation where we keep our ability to keep our heads and recognize that the ecosystem still requires that we think about the now and the future at the same time. We have to be able to think about how to be competitive in this moment, and we have to think about what are we actually putting in place for the future version of our companies, for our families, for our, the planet. And I think the opportunity to recognize that more could be done with less was a really good reckoning for us to say, could we be using, cheaper chips, chips that use less power and be getting a more efficient model? That would probably be a good thing, so that we're using fewer resources in the long run and we're making more energy efficient use out of the AI models that we're running.
Yeah, no, I hope you're right. And that's kind of how, as soon as I saw the headline that morning, that was my initial impression. And maybe it's just a sense of optimism that it was a wake up call, like you said, of as good as we are, maybe these companies are, they have to keep stepping it up. But maybe they still are the Yankees and these other guys are just getting a little too excited too quickly. Time will tell. Maybe just to kind of wrap up here, a final pivot, Kate, is what would be your advice, if you could kind of summarize, to maybe a leader, okay, maybe that seasoned exec that's, in the late innings, and then that young professional that's an employee, maybe they have an entrepreneurial spirit, maybe they don't. In the context of, I think, that executive is constantly feeling the pressure of, I need to innovate, I got to create, or I'm just going to get past tomorrow. And then I think that younger person that's saying, I don't even know what to study or to apply for, because is this job going to be around in 5 years with AI taking over all these roles? If you could, I know I just threw two kind of questions at you, but maybe address
No, they're
those.
great. They're great. Because I think I like what you're asking there, because it actually gives me the opportunity to say that both of those perspectives are so needed right now. We need the perspective of someone who is late innings, as you say, right? Like, human wisdom is one of the most direly needed skills, right? We need people who can come from later in life and sort of do the synthesizing and sum up some of the experiences that they've had and what truly matters on a human level. They may not have the latest and greatest familiarity with all of the tech tools. That's fine. But I think the human wisdom that we can distill is badly needed. At the same time, what I think we can look for from the younger entrepreneurial, sort of like eager, hungry type of person is that they can be looking toward the future and be seeing a very different horizon than what someone who doesn't have that same sense of eagerness and hunger might see. So we need to balance those. We need to bring those two perspectives together. And I think it's a great opportunity. When I've advised startups and helped them think about their leadership teams and their advisory teams, I always like to see a great mix of, age diversity and industry diversity, things like that. So it's a huge opportunity for people to be thinking about, how could I bring some, different kinds of diversity to the discussion and the leadership of my team? How could I be thinking about who's going to be able to answer questions that I might have? Who's going to be able to bring a perspective that I can't necessarily speak to? And this is, not to use, I think diversity is an overloaded word right now, and we tend to shy away from it because it seems political. But I mean, think about diversity in the broadest sense of the word, in the sense that we need to be able to supplement what it is that we lack. And that can mean the sort of traditional sense of diversity. It can also mean diversity in a sense of, we've got a bunch of young guys here. It would probably be good to bring on the perspective of, someone who's not a young guy. You could bring an older woman into the mix. You could bring diversity, right? Like it could be a range of people that you could think about then. But I think that's the biggest opportunity, is to recognize that there's so much strength coming at it from this fresh, young perspective, and there's so much strength coming at it from the sort of seasoned wise perspective. And we're going to only solve some of the biggest problems in front of us by bringing together as much of that both and as we possibly can.
That's cool. No, I think that's a great goal for any organization. And the last thing, if I could just kind of pose to you, because I've been thinking about this with all the AI and these different ideas we're discussing, is, and I've heard this, that the more and more AI comes about, and you have the people that are like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose my job, that are kind of filled with fear of it's going to replace everything. And then the people that kind of see the silver lining and say it's just going to free up more time for us to either A, enjoy life, or B, if we're that workaholic entrepreneur, to go create new things. That's what I wanted to ask you about. Do you think this is like an age where we need more and more creators and imagination? Is that something that's critical, or the person out there that's saying like, oh, I have no imagination, I can't think, I don't, like, is that a drawback? Like, what, just your take, I guess, on being a creator, because I feel like you're seeing more and more of that now than obviously back in the day of I'll work 9 to 5.
Yeah, so I think your two examples of, this is going to replace all the jobs or this is going to free us all up or whatever, neither of those are true, and both of those are true. I think we've been able to see how AI and all the other automative technology has just disrupted and augmented the type of work and the type of jobs that we see for the most part. There are certainly examples of job roles like, shopping clerk or, checkout clerk or truck driver, where there's notoriously, some suspicion that those jobs may not exist in their current form. But for the most part, most of us are familiar with the idea that as new technology comes in, what it does is replace certain tasks, not certain jobs, right? And jobs are bundles of tasks. So all we do is just like go ahead and say like, that task is yours now, robot, and I do these other tasks over here. We've sort of shifted it around. I think the creator function is an interesting one. So, you and I talked a little bit before we began recording about one of the ideas, a talk that I do from time to time with financial organizations and fintech groups. I did it with Bloomberg and so on, is this notion of the weirding of the future of money. And one of the insights there is that the future of money is weird mostly because the future of value is weird. That increasingly, as we think about digital forms of money and the ways in which money has become increasingly virtualized, and there's sort of this ether sense of money, and there's this kind of more rooted sense of the blockchain and a lot of different experimental forms around money. But really what that comes down to is the disruption of this sense of value. And value really stems from, what we value, what we put meaning around. And meaning has a lot of tie to what we create and what we deem worthy of our creation. So these themes really do tie together in a stepwise way that I could spend 45 minutes doing a keynote on. But I think hopefully those thought provocations are enough to get you and your listeners thinking about where the opportunity space is there. I think that we have the opportunity to think about creating in new ways and making new kinds of contribution through creativity, valuing those forms of creativity in a different and new way, and creating new revenue streams around it. But I also think we have to recognize that traditional value streams and traditional monetary streams are completely disrupted around traditional creativity as well. So around music and film and all of these sort of traditional creative fields are very disrupted from the digitization of IP and of value. So huge discussion, one that takes a lot to sort of break down and rebuild, but I think one that is worth our investigating and pondering. So I leave that sort of as an unfinished discussion for your audience to consider, and maybe we'll come back and have a future discussion about it at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it just has given us, I think, so much to kind of think about. I feel like I'm thinking about the future as we're having this conversation. And yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's so much good to look forward to, and hopefully we can all use it for the better of humanity. I know that's the dream.
I really hope so. I'll leave you with one thought, by the way, Brian, which is that
Sure.
you asked about this optimistic view, and I will say I've typically been using the term strategic optimism. And that is to say, I think that we can be optimistic about the future if we're strategic about how we go about it, right? If we put the right kinds of guardrails in place, if we ask the right questions, if we engage the right way in this through line thinking and put the right actions and decisions in place, we have a very good chance of creating a much better future than we sometimes fear we might be facing. And so I would invite all of your listeners to share in that idea of strategic optimism and wholeheartedly embrace it, because what it means is that you get to set the brighter future that we would like to have by making good decisions.
I love it. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Kate. We'll
you.
be sure to put some of your information in the new book in our show notes today so everybody can check it out and follow you and learn more about it. And thanks once again for a great conversation.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of the Caderna Podcast. We've had the pleasure today of speaking with Kate O'Neill. Again, I'll put all our info in the show notes. Please be sure to like and subscribe wherever you're watching or listening, and we will see you next time.
This podcast is intended for the general public and for informational purposes only. The show does not provide any recommendations or investment advice regarding any specific account type, service, strategy, or product, or to otherwise act in any fiduciary or other capacity. Please contact a financial professional for guidance and information that is specific to your situation. Brian Caderna does not provide tax or legal advice. Please contact your accountant or legal advisor to discuss your situation. Guest speakers and their firms are not affiliated with or endorsed by Park Avenue Securities, Guardian, or Caderna Financial Team, and opinions stated are their own. All investments contain risk and may lose value. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. References to specific securities, asset classes, and financial markets are for illustrative purposes only and do not constitute a solicitation, offer, or recommendation to purchase or sell a security. Brian Caderna is a registered representative and financial advisor of Park Avenue Securities, LLC, PAS. OSJ 300 Broadacres Drive, Suite 175, Bloomfield, New Jersey, 07003. Phone number 973-244-4420. Securities products and advisory services offered through PAS, member FINRA SIPC. Financial representative of the Guardian Life Insurance Company of America, Guardian, New York, New York. PAS is a wholly owned subsidiary of Guardian. Caderna Financial Team is not an affiliate or subsidiary of PAS or Guardian. California Insurance License Number 0K04194.